TWA Flight 800. In the hushed twilight of July 17, 1996, a routine TWA flight number 800 lifted off from New York's JFK Airport on its journey to Europe. But just 12 minutes into the flight, with all 230 people on board, something terrible happened. A sudden, violent explosion ripped through the Boeing 747, turning the massive plane into a burning fireball that rained down into the dark Atlantic Ocean off the coast of New York. The world watched in horror, and as investigators raced to the scene, speculation swirled about a possible missile strike or terrorist bomb. The FBI launched an intense criminal investigation that lasted for over a year, but they found no proof of an outside attack. This left the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, to piece together the fragments of the plane and solve the most extensive and expensive air disaster mystery in U.S. history. They even painstakingly reconstructed a portion of the fuselage to better understand the catastrophic failure. After 4 years of painstaking work, the NTSB's conclusion was as chilling as it was simple. The cause was not a weapon, but a volatile explosion of flammable fuel vapors within the plane's center fuel tank. They believe the most likely culprit was a short circuit from faulty wiring, which ignited the superheated air and fuel mixture. The investigation revealed that the jumbo jet's air conditioning units, located directly beneath the tank, had warmed the fuel inside to a dangerous temperature, creating the perfect conditions for disaster. The findings led to new safety regulations for aircraft, forever changing how planes are designed and maintained to prevent another tragedy like TWA Flight 800. These new rules forced a complete rethink of fuel system safety across the entire airline industry. USAir Flight 1493. On February 1, 1991, Los Angeles International Airport became the stage for one of the deadliest runway collisions in U.S. history. USAir Flight 1493, a Boeing 737 arriving from Columbus, Ohio, was cleared to land on runway 24L. At the same time, SkyWest Flight 5569, a Fairchild Metroliner carrying 12 people, had been instructed to taxi into position on that very runway. In the tower, distractions and a misplaced flight strip led the controller to believe the path was clear. The 737 touched down and, almost instantly, its crew saw the small turboprop directly ahead. There was no time for evasive action. The jet slammed into the Metroliner, crushing it beneath its fuselage before skidding off the runway into a vacant fire station, where flames quickly consumed the forward section. All 12 aboard the SkyWest plane perished. On the 737, 23 more lives were lost, many trapped in the smoke-filled forward cabin. Survivors in the rear escaped through overwing and rear exits, but chaos and blocked doors slowed the evacuation. The National Transportation Safety Board later determined that a breakdown in LAX's air traffic control procedures was the root cause. The tower's ground radar wasn't working, controllers were overburdened, and the runway was being used simultaneously for takeoffs and landings. The accident led to sweeping changes. LAX now separates landing and departing traffic on different runways, built a taller control tower with improved sight lines, and the FAA upgraded flammability standards on all U.S. aircraft. Among the survivors was billionaire David Koch, who later described the ordeal as life-changing. For others, it was a grim reminder of how quickly routine operations can turn tragic. Flight 1493's legacy reshaped runway safety in America, ensuring lessons paid for in lives would not be repeated. Air Florida Flight 90. On January 13, 1982, Air Florida Flight 90 lifted off from Washington National Airport in the grip of a brutal snowstorm. Within moments, the Boeing 737 struck the 14th Street Bridge and plunged into the icy Potomac River. 78 lives were lost that afternoon, 74 on board and 4 motorists on the bridge. But the disaster became remembered as much for its acts of heroism as for its tragedy. The aircraft had been poorly de-iced, its engines never switched to anti-ice mode, and the crew's inexperience with winter operations compounded the risk. Taxiing too close behind another jet in hopes of melting wing ice only made things worse. As the plane struggled into the air, the first officer voiced concern about power readings that didn't add up. The captain pressed forward. The 737 staggered to just 352 feet before stalling and falling from the sky, its fuselage skidding across traffic before breaking through the frozen river. Survivors clung desperately to wreckage in 34-degree Fahrenheit water, their strength fading by the minute. A U.S. Park Police helicopter crew hovered so low its skids touched the river, lowering lines again and again. One man, later identified as Arlen D. Williams Jr., repeatedly passed the rescue line to others, saving lives until he himself drowned. On shore, bystander Lenny Skutnik shed his coat and dove into the freezing current to pull a struggling passenger to safety, an act later honored by President Reagan in his State of the Union address. The NTSB investigation traced the crash to pilot error and faulty de-icing practices, prompting sweeping changes in airline procedure. Yet beyond regulations and reports, the story of Flight 90 endures as a stark reminder of human fallibility and the extraordinary courage that can rise from catastrophe. Pan Am Flight 759. Pan Am Flight 759 was supposed to be a routine journey from Miami to San Diego, with a stop in New Orleans. On July 9, 1982, the Boeing 727, known as Clipper Defiance, began its takeoff from New Orleans International Airport in stormy, unstable weather. Within seconds, it lifted briefly into the air, only to be forced down by a microburst-induced wind shear. The jet struck trees just beyond the runway, tore through homes in the suburb of Kenner, and erupted into flames. All 145 people on board were killed, along with 8 on the ground. 4 others were injured, and 6 houses were leveled. The crew was experienced. Captain Kenneth McCullers had logged over 11,000 hours in 727s, and First Officer Donald Pierce and Flight Engineer Leo Noon were both regarded as skilled and conscientious. Yet even their expertise was no match for the sudden, invisible downdraft that struck during climbout. Witnesses described swirling winds and thunderstorms over the departure path. The jet climbed to only about 150 feet before sinking back toward the neighborhoods below. Amid the devastation, one image of hope stood out. A 16-month-old baby pulled from the wreckage of her home, alive in her crib while her mother and sister perished. The tragedy devastated families across the U.S. and abroad, with victims from more than a dozen countries. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the crash was caused by the microburst and compounded by limited wind shear detection technology at the time. The disaster, along with similar accidents in the 1980s, spurred the FAA to mandate advanced wind shear detection systems at airports and on aircraft. More than 4 decades later, Flight 759 is remembered as one of Louisiana's darkest days. A moment when silence, policy, and human grief converged to reshape aviation safety forever. Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182. On the clear morning of September 25, 1978, Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182 was on its final leg into San Diego after a routine stop in Los Angeles. At the controls of the Boeing 727 was Captain James McFerrin, a seasoned pilot with more than 14,000 flight hours. Alongside sat First Officer Robert Fox and Flight Engineer Martin 1A. Both highly experienced on the 727. The 7 crew members guided 128 passengers on board, including 29 PSA employees returning home. At 8:59 a.m., air traffic control alerted the crew to a Cessna 172 nearby. 2 pilots occupied the smaller plane, one a commercial instructor, the other a Marine sergeant practicing instrument approaches. The PSA crew reported the Cessna in sight, but within moments lost visual contact. They speculated it had passed off to the right, when, in reality, the smaller aircraft was directly beneath their nose. At 9:01 a.m., with landing clearance already granted, the Boeing 727 descended toward Lindbergh Field. 16 seconds before impact, a voice in the cockpit said, "There's one underneath," but it was too late. At 2,600 feet, the 727 plowed directly into the Cessna, tearing it apart. Witnesses described a crunching sound, an explosion, and a fireball overhead as the Boeing spiraled downward. The jet slammed into the North Park neighborhood 3 miles from the airport at 260 knots, leveling homes, igniting cars, and scattering wreckage across city blocks. All 135 aboard the 727, both Cessna pilots and 7 people on the ground were killed. The NTSB later cited the PSA's crew's failure to maintain visual separation and errors in air traffic control procedures as the causes. The tragedy reshaped U.S. aviation, leading to radar-based separation rules, stricter airspace control, and eventually the creation of TCAS, collision avoidance systems now standard on airliners. First Air Flight 6560. On August 20, 2011, a Boeing 737-200, operated by First Air, was on approach to Resolute Bay, a rugged Arctic outpost in Nunavut. Designated Flight 6560, it carried 11 passengers and 4 crew members from Yellowknife, but only 3 would survive. The aircraft, obscured by clouds, struck a hill just 1 mile east of the runway as the pilots attempted a go-around. The impact tore the jet into 3 sections and sparked a fierce fire that consumed much of the fuselage. The investigation revealed a cascade of small errors that built into tragedy. The descent began too late, leaving the crew overloaded at a critical stage. While on autopilot, an inadvertent control input caused the system to partially disengage, no longer tracking the runway but instead holding a false heading. The aircraft drifted east, parallel to the intended path. Making matters worse, the compass system, already prone to drift so near the North Magnetic Pole, had not been recalibrated. By the time the pilots realized the error, the Boeing was fatally off course. The first officer recognized the danger and warned the captain 18 times. But his cautions never triggered decisive action. Only seconds before impact, the captain called for a go-around, too late to escape the rising terrain. Canadian forces conducting Operation Nanook nearby with an exercise simulating a remote plane crash rushed to respond in real time, rescuing the 3 survivors. The Transportation Safety Board later classified the disaster as controlled flight into terrain. Its report emphasized unstable approaches, breakdowns in crew communication, and missed opportunities to abort. The crash of Flight 6560 remains a stark reminder that in aviation, discipline, vigilance, and communication are as vital as technology when the margin for error narrows to seconds. Mexicana de Aviation Flight 940. On March 31, 1986, Mexicana de Aviation Flight 940 lifted off from Mexico City, bound for Los Angeles with planned stops in Puerto Vallarta and Mazatlan. On board the Boeing 727 were 159 passengers and 8 crew members. Families, tourists, diplomats, even film industry workers. Just 15 minutes into the flight, while climbing through 29,400 feet, an explosion shattered the comm. Oxygen masks dropped, alarms blared, and smoke seeped through the cabin door. Within minutes, the jet was burning in the sky over the Sierra Madre Occidental. Moments later, it broke apart midair, scattering wreckage across the mountains. All 167 lives were lost, making it the deadliest crash in Mexican aviation history and the worst involving a Boeing 727. The investigation unraveled a chilling chain of errors. The culprit was traced to the left wheel well, where faulty brakes caused a tire to overheat on takeoff. Instead of being filled with inert nitrogen, the tire had been filled with air, highly flammable under extreme heat and pressure. As the landing gear retracted, trapped in a poorly ventilated space, temperatures soared past 2,912 degrees Fahrenheit. The tire exploded, rupturing hydraulic and fuel lines. Fire raced upward through the fuselage, melting more than 400 square feet of the airframe in under 4 minutes. The inferno severed control cables, overwhelmed the structure, and tore the tail away from the aircraft. The victims represented multiple nations: 147 from Mexico, 8 from France, 6 from the United States, 4 from Sweden, and 2 from Canada. Among them were 22 children, an entire French family, and the wife and children of Captain Carlos Alberto Guadarrama Sixtos, who himself was at the controls. The aftermath forced sweeping changes. Mexico mandated stricter aircraft maintenance oversight, while the US FAA issued directives requiring nitrogen-filled tires to prevent similar disasters. USAir Flight 427. September 8, 1994, began as an ordinary evening approach into Pittsburgh, USAir's busiest hub. Flight 427, a Boeing 737-300, with 132 souls aboard, was lined up behind a Delta 727. At 6,000 feet, traveling close to 190 knots, the 737 suddenly shuddered. Thumps echoed through the fuselage, the autopilot snapped off, and within seconds the aircraft rolled hard left. The crew, Captain Peter Germano and First Officer Charles Emmett, veterans with over 20,000 combined hours, fought back with everything they had. Yokes wrenched right, elevators pulled, but the jet refused to respond. Over the next 28 seconds, the plane pitched nearly nose down at 80 degrees, banked 60 degrees left, and slammed into the ground at 300 miles per hour. No one survived. Witnesses at a nearby soccer field described it as if the aircraft had simply fallen from the sky. The investigation became the second longest in U.S. history. The NTSB discovered the unthinkable. A rudder had reversed. A tiny servo valve inside the rudder power control unit, when exposed to hot hydraulic fluid and then cooled, could jam and send the surface into the opposite direction of pilot input. Worse, at lower speeds, a fully deflected rudder made recovery impossible. Flight 427 had become the key to solving not only its own mystery, but also the unexplained crash of United Flight 585 in 1991 and the near loss of Eastwind Flight 517 in 1996. The consequences were sweeping. Boeing was forced to redesign the rudder system across the 737 fleet, over 3,400 in the aircraft in the US alone. And the airlines added new training on crossover speed and full rudder deflection recovery. Families of the victims helped push Congress to pass laws guaranteeing better treatment of crash victims' relatives. Flight 427 remains the deadliest aviation accident in Pennsylvania's history, and a turning point that reshaped how safety is engineered into one of the world's most common airliners. Cubana de Aviation Flight 0972. On May 18, 2018, Havana's Jose Marti International Airport became the scene of Cuba's deadliest air disaster in nearly 3 decades. Cubana de Aviation Flight 972, a Boeing 737-201 leased from Mexican carrier USAir, lifted off bound for Holguín with 113 people on board. Within moments, eyewitnesses saw the plane veer unnaturally, one even describing an engine ablaze. Just 12 miles from the city center, the aircraft plunged into farmland and train tracks, erupting into fire. No one on the ground was hurt, but nearly everyone on board was lost. The impact was devastating. 112 lives cut short, leaving only one survivor, a young Cuban woman who endured catastrophic injuries, burns, paralysis, and amputation, yet fought her way back to life after months in intensive care. Among the victims were 10 pastors of the Church of the Nazarene and their spouses, a loss that rippled through religious communities across the island. The aircraft itself carried a troubled history. Built in 1979, it had changed hands across multiple airlines before being acquired by USAir in 2011. Allegations surfaced almost immediately about the airline's safety record. Former employees pointed to corners cut in maintenance and a reputation for overloading flights. Guyana had even banned the plane from its airspace the year before, citing improper baggage loading. Investigators from Cuba, Mexico, and the United States recovered the black boxes and uncovered a chain of human errors. The crew's weight and balance calculations were fatally flawed. Too many passengers crammed into the forward cabin, cargo improperly distributed, and fuel loaded beyond limits by nearly 5,000 pounds. Instead of lifting smoothly into the sky, the aircraft struggled under imbalance, climbed too steeply, stalled, and fell. The final report, released in September 2019, was damning. A collapse born from miscalculations, poor training, and operational standards far below what aviation demands. Flight 972 now stands as a solemn reminder of how human error, compounded by oversight failures, can turn an ordinary departure into an irreversible tragedy.